¿Cómo están? Bienvenidos todos a esta conversación con la doctora Milena Buchs, profesora asociada en sustentabilidad, economía y transiciones de bajo carbón de la Escuela de Tierra y Medio Ambiente de la Universidad de Leeds. Milena, bienvenida a la Plaza de Innovación y Cohesión Social.
Great, thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today.
La promoción de una transición justa o equitativa hacia una neutralidad climática es presentada como un objetivo clave dentro del Acuerdo Ecológico Europeo. ¿Cómo usted definiría, en pocas palabras, una transición justa? ¿Cuáles deberían ser los elementos principales de esta transición y cuáles son los principales retos?
Thank you so much for the invitation to talk to you today. So I think in general terms, I would define a just transition as one that distributes the costs and the benefits of the transition fairly, and that also offers an inclusive decision-making process. So in my view, a transition to net zero is of course very urgently needed, but the problem is often that the costs and benefits are quite unequally distributed. So one example that comes to mind is, for example, how the net zero transition would impact on workers in high carbon sectors, because their jobs might be at risk from this transition. So these workers then would need to be offered retraining and new job opportunities, as well as social security. And they would also need to have a say within these processes. And just transition, to my mind, also means that the pay and working conditions in the green sector are good as well. And then another example of an unequal distribution of costs and benefits in the net zero transition is that taxes, for example, on emissions or on energy are often regressive. And that means that these types of taxes, and that also applies to any price increase in energy, for example, that this will always burden poorer people more than richer people in relative terms, so relative to their income. So in other words, I think mechanisms would then be needed to counteract these regressive impacts and to compensate poorer people for these regressive impacts. And then in addition, you have this whole global dimension to the net zero transition, and from a distributive perspective. So for example, countries in the global south are already very much impacted by climate change. And I think the global north has a big responsibility to support the global south to protect themselves from these impacts, because it's mainly the global north that is responsible, historically speaking, for climate change. And then a couple more points here. So the production of green technologies can sometimes have negative environmental and social impacts in other parts of the world. So one example would be the environmental impacts from lithium mining, for example, and lots of that happens in South America. And these types of impacts, I think, need to be avoided because, Western countries are often profiting from these types of technologies, but they do not take into account the negative impacts that it has in other parts of the world. And likewise, the benefits from the net zero transition are often quite unevenly distributed. So very large profits can be made from new green technologies. And I think we need to ensure that these profits are fairly distributed. At the moment, at least in the global north, it's also the case that it's mostly richer people who can afford things like buying an electric car or putting solar panels on their roof. And these sorts of opportunities need to be much more evenly distributed. So there needs to be much more support for poorer people to be able to take part in these types of developments. And yeah, you asked about the main challenges. I think there are quite a few challenges related to this. I keep this very brief because we can maybe talk about this a little bit more, but I think it requires a change in mindsets, in political priorities, in the way we make decisions, so decision-making processes, and ultimately, I think also in power structures.
All right, perfect. Now, el Acuerdo Ecológico Europeo así como la facultad de recuperación y resiliencia de la Unión Europea, confían en la ambición de conjugar el crecimiento económico, notablemente el crecimiento del PIB, y la estabilidad fiscal con la protección medioambiental y la justicia social. En tu opinión, ¿hasta qué punto son estos objetivos compatibles y cuáles son los principales retos para crear una sinergia entre estos objetivos?
Thank you so much for this question, which is a really big question, and
Yes.
I try to keep the answer short as possible. So I think based on the evidence that exists so far about the relationship between GDP growth and environmental impacts, I'm fairly skeptical that we can achieve climate targets and keep our economies growing at the same time. So I belong to the sort of post-growth camp in this debate. So emissions and GDP would really need to be decoupled in absolute terms and at a very fast rate, if we wanted to be able to combine GDP growth and emission reduction. And that would mean that we would need gains in energy efficiency that would need to speed up by about 8 to 10-fold to levels that we have never achieved in history. So I hope that made sense. So this idea about absolute decoupling means that, an example for absolute decoupling would be if global GDP increases and global emissions decrease in absolute terms, so that we don't just have a relative decline of emissions per GDP, where the emission intensity per dollar of world GDP, for example, declines, but global emissions could still increase. So that would be relative decoupling, but that's not sufficient. And so far, we only see relative decoupling. There has been absolute decoupling in sort of individual countries for shorter periods of time, but never at the scale that we would need to really achieve climate targets. So that is one of the key problems that we face, I think. And this is why many ecological economists argue that we need a new economic approach, which prioritizes within decision-making the achievement of environmental and social objectives instead of just prioritizing GDP growth. And so that would require a prioritization of green investments and still growth in that area, but a reduction of production and consumption in aggregate terms. And so one challenge is that economic growth is often seen as necessary to support social objectives, because you asked about the relationship between economic, environmental, and social objectives. And so this is where often the tension comes in, right? So the idea is often that things like employment, the reduction of poverty and inequality, that they rely on economic growth. But there's a lot of interesting thinking going on in this area. And so, for example, some modeling by economists like Tim Jackson and Peter Victor has actually shown that social objectives can be achieved without economic growth, because ultimately, these outcomes depend on policy decisions, basically on the extent of redistribution and pre-distribution in society. So in other words, they have shown that, you can keep employment stable if we redistribute employment more evenly. We can actually keep inequality stable if we have a more redistributive system from the start. So in my view, it should be possible to combine post-growth with social objectives, but it is more difficult to combine the achievement of climate targets with economic growth.
Okay, perfect. Now, ¿cuáles funciones podría realizar el estado de bienestar en la transición hacia economías y sociedades más medioambientalmente sustentables? ¿Existen políticas o prácticas innovadoras que apunten a crear sistemas de bienestar más medioambientalmente sustentables?
Yes, I think there are. So I think there are three main ways in which the welfare state could contribute to a just transition. The first, as I have already briefly mentioned, is to establish this prioritization of social and environmental objectives in decision-making. And that would need to happen at all different levels. So at the international, the national, regional, political level, but also actually within businesses, for example. So the ultimate goal would here to be to create a fairer and more equal society from the start, which would then improve the distributional outcomes of a fair transition, because the current outcomes very much already depend on existing inequalities in society. And so then the second thing that would be important is to support workers who are affected by the transition to a green economy, and to compensate for the sort of unfair, distributionally unfair outcomes of some of the climate policies that I've been talking about. So any type of carbon tax or carbon trading system, they would often have regressive impacts. So that would be the second objective or second mechanism through which welfare states could contribute to a fair transition. And then third, I think the welfare state should also ensure that everyone's basic needs are met. And not only for healthcare and education, but also for things like energy, water, food, transport, and communication. And so there's currently actually a very nice and lively debate going on about something that is called here in the UK universal basic services. And the idea is here to expand such services into these other areas that I just mentioned, so including energy and transport, for example. And so that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that these types of services should be provided directly by the state, but the state, and hence the welfare state, could play an important role in setting frameworks for the provision of these services, for setting quality standards, including limits on profits, and also facilitating democratic decision-making processes within the provision of these infrastructures and services.
Okay, great. Bueno, finalmente vamos con nuestra última pregunta. Cambio climático, degradación medioambiental y desigualdades socioterritoriales son retos globales. En consecuencia, con el fin de ser considerado como completamente justa, la transición hacia un modelo de desarrollo medioambientalmente más sustentable debería ser aplicada a nivel mundial. ¿Cuáles son, en su opinión, los principales obstáculos de esta transición global?
Thank you for that question. I think it is a really important question. Sadly, also one that I don't have many sort of very optimistic answers to. So I absolutely agree that these are all global challenges which absolutely require a global response or global responses. But sadly, I think many obstacles exist to achieve such a global transition. So one main obstacle, I think, is that different countries and regions still have very vastly different interests and positions in relation to this transition. So just as an example, many poorer regions would actually need a lot of support, I think, from richer countries to protect them from climate change impacts and to help them to establish sustainable economies and address social issues like poverty, hunger, and violent conflict. But many rich countries are still very reluctant to share their wealth more widely and help the global south, to achieve these objectives and to reduce global inequalities more generally. And so another obstacle, I think, is just generally speaking, the decision-making processes and institutions that we have currently in place. So as you probably all know, that the global decision-making process that exists at the moment very much relies on consensus. So for example, the United Nations climate change conferences, which is kind of the main mechanism for climate change policies at the global level to be made. But we have seen in the past, of course, that these processes can be very much obstructed by powerful players and countries that act out of self-interest and don't, commit to certain, to climate change targets and to policies. And so at the moment, I'm not particularly optimistic that this situation will change very much in the foreseeable future. So I think the ultimate obstacle is perhaps a worldwide economic system that currently prioritizes profit over people's well-being and the environment, And the other related obstacle is short-termist decision-making, which prevails in policy-making. And that means that we are unable to take future generations' rights into account, which in a way is very much part of the just transition, right? So just transition is not only between people right now within countries and across the globe, but it's also an intergenerational. So we also need to consider intergenerational justice here. And sadly, that is currently not really built into decision-making processes.
Bueno, como ya escucharon, escuchamos a la doctora Milena Buchs, profesora asociada en sustentabilidad, economía y transiciones de bajo carbón de la Escuela de Tierra y Medio Ambiente de la Universidad de Leeds. Fue todo un placer escucharla y conocer acerca de sus opiniones. Muchas gracias, y esto fue La Plaza de la Innovación y Cohesión Social. Hasta luego.